The last confirmed sighting of the Crawford family occurred on November 14, 1862, in the mountain town of Harlan, Kentucky. Samuel Crawford, the family patriarch, had led his extended family, 32 people in total, into the wilderness, telling the town's general store owner they were heading to a safer place away from the war. The storekeeper, Marcus Whitley, later told authorities that Samuel seemed anxious, almost frantic, purchasing an unusual quantity of medical supplies, seeds, and preserved foods. He paid in gold coins, which was remarkable given that most people were trading in Confederate scrip or Union greenbacks by then. Samuel Crawford was a respected physician who had studied at the University of Pennsylvania before settling in eastern Kentucky in 1847. He had built a successful practice treating miners and their families, earning a reputation for his knowledge of herbal remedies and his willingness to travel deep into the mountains to reach patients. His wife, Margaret, had given birth to 7 children, and the extended family included his 2 brothers, their wives, and their children. The Crawfords were known as good people, educated, hard-working, and deeply religious. The Civil War had torn through Kentucky with brutal efficiency. Though officially neutral, the state became a battleground where neighbor fought neighbor, brother fought brother. Confederate and Union forces moved through the mountains like opposing storms, requisitioning food, livestock, and young men for their armies. Samuel had treated wounded soldiers from both sides, which made him valuable to everyone and trusted by no one. Some townspeople whispered that he had information both armies wanted, though nobody could say exactly what that might be. The morning the Crawfords left, several witnesses saw the long column of wagons heading east into the Cumberland Mountains. They carried everything they owned: furniture, tools, livestock, even Samuel's medical library. His oldest son, Thomas, drove the lead wagon. The other men of the family walked alongside, rifles ready. The women and children rode in the covered wagons, their faces showing both fear and determination. It was not unusual for families to flee the war zones, but something about the Crawford departure felt different. They were not running from something. They were running towards something specific. Within days, Confederate raiders came looking for them. Captain James Morrison, leading a unit of irregular cavalry, questioned everyone in Harlan about the Crawford family's destination. He offered gold for information. When that failed, he offered threats. But nobody knew where they had gone. The trails heading east split into dozens of possibilities, winding through valleys and over ridges that all looked the same. Morrison's men searched for 2 weeks before giving up. By then, early winter snows had covered any tracks the wagons might have left. Over the following months, the war intensified. Sherman marched to the sea. Grant hammered at Lee's defenses in Virginia. The mountain communities of Kentucky tried to survive, caught between armies that took what they needed and left destruction behind. Occasionally, someone would mention the Crawford family, wondering if they had made it to safety or if they had perished in some remote hollow, their bones picked clean by wolves. As the months turned into years, people stopped wondering. The Crawfords became just another family lost to the war, their fate unknown and ultimately irrelevant to those struggling to survive. But Samuel Crawford had not died. He had found what he was looking for, a hidden valley in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a place so remote that it appeared on no maps. The valley was accessible only through a narrow gorge that most travelers would miss entirely. Inside, a clear stream provided water, and the land was fertile enough for farming. Steep cliffs surrounded the valley on 3 sides, creating a natural fortress. It was the perfect place to disappear. By the spring of 1866, the war had been over for nearly a year. The nation was attempting to rebuild, though the wounds ran deep, and healing would take generations. In Kentucky, former soldiers returned to find their farms destroyed, their families scattered. The state government, such as it was, tried to restore order and account for the missing. County clerks compiled lists of the dead, the displaced, and the disappeared. The Crawford family appeared on these lists, presumed casualties of the conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Marsh of the United States Army had a different interest in finding the Crawfords. Marsh had served in the Army Medical Department during the war, treating diseases that killed more soldiers than bullets ever did. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, cholera. These were the real enemies. After the war, Marsh had been assigned to document medical practices in remote regions, particularly folk medicine, that might have value for the military. Someone had told him about Samuel Crawford, the physician who had supposedly discovered treatments for mountain fever that conventional medicine could not cure. Marsh assembled a small expedition in late February 1866. He brought 2 other physicians, Dr. William Foster and Dr. James Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had worked in California mining camps before the war. He also hired 6 former soldiers as guides and security, men who knew the Kentucky mountains and could handle themselves if they encountered bandits or hostile locals. They carried scientific instruments, medical supplies, and enough provisions for a month in the wilderness. The expedition left Harlan on March 1st, following the same route the Crawfords had taken 3.5 years earlier. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, but Marsh's guides were skilled trackers. They found signs that wagons had passed this way long ago, broken tree branches at wagon height, old ruts in the earth where wheels had cut deep, a rusted horseshoe nailed to a tree as a trail marker. They pushed deeper into the mountains, crossing ridges where the wind cut through their heavy coats and descending into valleys where the silence felt oppressive. On March 15th, they found the first real evidence. A campsite in a sheltered hollow showed signs of long occupation, fire rings, the remains of a lean-to shelter, and carved initials on a tree, TC 1862. Thomas Crawford. Marsh's excitement grew. They were on the right trail. The guide studied the surrounding terrain, looking for indications of which direction the Crawfords had gone from this camp. They found wagon tracks leading east, toward a section of mountains that looked impassable. 2 days later, they discovered the entrance to the hidden valley. It was exactly as the guides had predicted it would be, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. A narrow gorge barely wide enough for a wagon cut through a cliff face, concealed by the angle of approach. Trees grew at the entrance, partially blocking the view. Someone had deliberately arranged fallen logs to make the entrance look like a dead end. But Marsh's guides noticed that the fallen logs had been cut with saws, not broken by storms. The expedition moved cautiously through the gorge. The walls rose 60 feet on either side, creating a natural tunnel that amplified every sound. After 200 yards, the gorge opened into a valley perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide. And there, impossible but undeniable, was a settlement. Cabins with smoke rising from chimneys, cultivated fields, livestock in pens, people moving about their daily work. The Crawfords had not just survived, they had built a community. The expedition's appearance caused immediate alarm. People stopped working and stared. Children were called inside. Men emerged from cabins carrying rifles. For a long moment nobody moved. Then a tall man with a grey beard walked forward, moving with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to authority. He was thin, his clothes worn but clean, and his eyes showed both wariness and intelligence. He stopped 10 yards from Marsh's group and waited. Marsh stepped forward, removing his military cap. He introduced himself and explained his mission. The bearded man listened without expression. When Marsh finished, the man spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, as if he had not spoken much in recent years. He said his name was Samuel Crawford, and yes, these were his family and descendants. He asked what the government wanted with them. The reunion between the Crawford family and the outside world was not the joyful occasion one might expect. Samuel Crawford spoke with Marsh for over an hour that first evening, standing in the open air rather than inviting the expedition into his home. His answers were careful, measured, revealing little about why they had fled or what they had experienced during their isolation. When Marsh asked about the family's health, Samuel's response was strange. He said they were all well, remarkably well, considering the circumstances. He said this with an expression that Marsh later described in his journal as almost apologetic, as if good health was something to regret. The expedition set up camp at the edge of the settlement, maintaining a respectful distance. Over the following days, Marsh and his fellow physicians observed the Crawford community with growing fascination. There were 27 people living in the valley, down from the original 32 who had entered in 1862. Samuel explained that 5 had died in the first winter, before they had fully adapted to the harsh conditions and limited diet. But since then, no one else had perished. No illnesses, no injuries that proved fatal, no complications from childbirth. 3 babies had been born in the valley, all healthy. Dr. Foster noticed it first. The children looked different, not dramatically so, but in subtle ways that became more apparent the longer he observed them. Their bone structure seemed slightly unusual, particularly in the facial features. Their skin had an odd quality to it, almost luminescent in certain light. Their eyes were extraordinarily clear, with irises that seemed to contain more color variation than normal. Foster mentioned these observations to Marsh, who began paying closer attention during his interactions with the family. Samuel Crawford resisted any suggestion that his family should return to civilization. He argued that they had built a good life in the valley, that they were self-sufficient and content. The war was over, Marsh told him, and there was no reason to remain hidden. Samuel's response was sharp. The war might be over, but the hatred it generated would last for decades. People who knew too much, who had helped both sides, would face accusations and retribution. Better to be presumed dead than to return and face questioning about what he had done during the conflict. But Marsh persisted. He explained that the Army Medical Department could benefit from Samuel's knowledge, that his isolation experiment had value for understanding human adaptation to limited resources and closed environments. He promised official protection, government support for the family's resettlement. Samuel listened but remained unconvinced. Finally, Marsh made an offer that changed the negotiation. He said the Army would pay substantial sums for Samuel to document his medical practices, his herbal treatments, his observations about disease resistance in isolated populations. For a family with no income and dwindling supplies, the offer was impossible to refuse. Samuel agreed to allow the expedition physicians to conduct a thorough examination of his family. What they discovered over the next week would challenge every assumption they held about human heredity and disease. The Crawford family showed resistance to common ailments that should have been impossible when Dr. Chen deliberately exposed several family members to material from his own recent bout of influenza. They showed no symptoms. When Foster tested their blood, he found properties he could not explain with the medical knowledge of 1866. The blood clotted faster than normal. Under his microscope, the blood cells appeared slightly different in shape from those of the expedition members. Most remarkably, the 3 children born in the valley were substantially different from their older siblings, who had been born before the isolation. The youngest child, a boy named Jacob, who was 2 years old, had physical characteristics that seemed to combine features from multiple family members in unusual ways. His hair was an unusual shade of reddish-brown that did not match either parent. His fingers were longer than typical for his age. His rate of development seemed accelerated. Samuel reported that Jacob had walked at 8 months and spoken in complete sentences before his first birthday. Marsh realized he was documenting something unprecedented. Isolation plus limited genetic diversity, plus unknown environmental factors, had created observable changes in a human population over just a few years. It should not have been possible. The prevailing scientific theories of heredity suggested that such changes required many generations. Yet here was evidence that under extreme conditions, human characteristics could shift more rapidly than anyone had imagined. He wrote in his journal that evening that this discovery would revolutionize medicine, biology, and the understanding of human nature itself. But Samuel Crawford had one condition before he would allow his family to leave the valley and return to the outside world. He insisted that all documentation of the family's unusual characteristics be kept confidential. He did not want his children and grandchildren treated as scientific curiosities or medical specimens. They were people, not experiments. Marsh agreed, though he knew that such a promise would be difficult to keep once the medical community learned what he had found. The journey out of the valley began on March 28, 1866. The Crawford family packed their essential possessions, leaving behind the cabins they had built and the fields they had cultivated. Samuel moved through the settlement one last time, checking each building, his face showing the pain of leaving a place that had kept them safe. His children and grandchildren followed, carrying bundles of clothing and tools, leading the few animals they could transport. The valley that had been their entire world for 3 years would be abandoned, left to return to wilderness. The expedition and the Crawford family formed a long column as they moved through the narrow gorge and back into the wider mountain landscape. The children who had been born in the valley stared at the open spaces with wonder and fear. They had never seen anything beyond the cliffs that surrounded their home. The older family members walked with mixed emotions, grateful to be returning to civilization, but uncertain about what reception awaited them. Samuel rode in the lead wagon next to Marsh, answering questions about his medical observations while carefully avoiding certain topics. As they traveled, Marsh continued his examinations and interviews. He measured skull dimensions, recorded family genealogies, and documented every unusual characteristic he could identify. Dr. Foster collected blood samples, preserving them in sealed vials for later analysis. Dr. Chen tested reflexes, vision and hearing, finding in every case that the Crawford family members showed abilities slightly above the normal range. It was as if the isolation and harsh conditions had selected for the strongest traits, eliminating weaknesses with brutal efficiency. They reached Harlan on April 3rd, causing a sensation. People who had known the Crawford family could barely believe they were alive. The reunion was complicated by the fact that other families had claimed the Crawford property, assuming the rightful owners were dead. Samuel said nothing about this, showing no anger or desire to reclaim what had been lost. He seemed focused entirely on ensuring his family's safe passage to wherever the government would take them next. Marsh arranged for the family to stay in a hotel while he sent reports to his superiors in Washington. The military response was swift and troubling. Senior officers in the Army Medical Department recognized the significance of Marsh's findings, but they also recognized the danger. If word spread that an isolated American family had developed unusual characteristics in just a few years, it would spark scientific debate, religious controversy, and social panic. The implications for understanding human nature were profound, but the potential for misuse of such information was equally serious. Within a week, Marsh received orders that contradicted his promises to Samuel Crawford. The orders directed Marsh to transport the Crawford family to a military medical facility in Washington, D.C., where they would undergo comprehensive examination by the nation's leading physicians. The family would be kept in isolation during this process, prevented from having contact with the general public. All findings would be classified as military secrets. Marsh was instructed to tell the Crawford family that this was for their protection, but he understood the truth. The government intended to study them regardless of their wishes, and the promise of confidentiality he had made was now meaningless. Marsh struggled with this situation. He had given his word to Samuel Crawford, and now he was being ordered to break that word. He considered resigning his commission, but that would not help the Crawford family. Someone else would simply take over the assignment. He decided to tell Samuel the truth about the orders and let the family decide how to respond. It was the only honorable option, even if it meant disobeying his superiors. On the evening of April 9th, exactly 1 year after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Marsh met with Samuel Crawford in private. He explained the orders from Washington, hiding nothing about what the government intended. Samuel listened without interruption, his expression hardening as the explanation continued. When Marsh finished, Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he said that he had expected this outcome. He had known from the moment the expedition found his valley that his family's freedom was ending. He had hoped for better, but he had prepared for worse. Samuel made a request that surprised Marsh. He asked for paper, ink, and time to write a complete account of what had happened in the valley. The real story, not the sanitized version he had told the expedition. He wanted to document the truth about why they had fled, what they had discovered during their isolation, and what he believed was happening to his family's biology. He would seal this document and entrust it to someone outside the military, with instructions that it should not be opened for 50 years. By then, he reasoned, the scientific community would be better equipped to understand, and the social climate might be more accepting. Marsh agreed to this request, though doing so violated his orders. He provided the materials and stood guard while Samuel wrote through the night. By dawn, Samuel had filled over 40 pages with precise handwriting, detailing observations that would have seemed like science fiction to most readers in 1866. He described genetic patterns, inherited traits, and environmental adaptations using language that suggested he understood far more about biology than should have been possible for a physician of his era. He sealed the pages in an oilskin pouch and gave it to Marsh with instructions for its safekeeping. The next morning, the Crawford family began the journey to Washington under military escort. They traveled by wagon to the nearest railroad, then by train through a landscape still recovering from war. Burned buildings, abandoned farms, and makeshift cemeteries marked the route. The family attracted attention at every stop, 27 people traveling together under guard, their unusual appearance prompting stares and whispered speculation. Samuel kept his family together, maintaining discipline and calm, preparing them for whatever would come next in the capital city, where their fate would be decided by people who saw them as specimens rather than human beings. The military medical facility in Washington occupied a converted mansion on the outskirts of the city, far enough from the center to provide privacy, but close enough for senior officials to visit when necessary. The Crawford family arrived on April 18, 1866, exhausted from 2 weeks of travel and increasingly anxious about their situation. The facility's director, Colonel Henry Blackwood, greeted them with professional courtesy, but made it clear that they were not guests. They would be staying in the building indefinitely, with no outside contact permitted until the medical examinations were complete. Armed guards stood at every exit, supposedly for the family's protection, though everyone understood their real purpose. The facility had been designed as a hospital during the war, treating officers who required discretion about their conditions. The rooms were clean and adequately furnished, but the windows had bars and the doors locked from the outside. Each family member was assigned a separate room, breaking up the household structure that had kept them cohesive through their years in the valley. Samuel protested this arrangement, arguing that separating the family would cause unnecessary stress, particularly for the children. Blackwood responded that individual isolation was necessary to prevent the family members from coordinating their responses during examinations and interviews. The decision was not negotiable. The examinations began the following morning and continued with systematic intensity for 6 weeks. Teams of physicians rotated through the facility, each bringing different areas of expertise. They measured every aspect of the Crawford family's physical characteristics, comparing them to standardized norms compiled from thousands of Army recruits. Height, weight, chest circumference, skull dimensions, limb proportions, hand size, foot length, tooth structure, hair texture, eye color variations, skin elasticity, reflexes, sensory acuity, lung capacity, heart rate patterns, blood pressure, body temperature. Everything that could be quantified was recorded in ledgers that grew thicker each day. Dr. Margaret Harrison was among the examining physicians, one of the few women permitted to work in military medicine. She had studied in Europe before the war and brought knowledge of recent advances in cellular biology that most American physicians lacked. Harrison became particularly interested in the children born in the valley, recognizing that they represented something unprecedented in medical literature. She spent hours observing young Jacob Crawford, the 2-year-old who had been born during the family's isolation. The child's development exceeded all normal parameters. His vocabulary was extensive, his coordination remarkable, and his ability to solve simple problems suggested cognitive function well beyond his age. Harrison also noticed something the male physicians had overlooked. The women in the Crawford family showed menstrual cycle synchronization far more pronounced than typically observed in communal living situations. More significantly, the 3 women who had given birth in the valley reported pregnancies and deliveries that differed from their previous experiences before the isolation. The pregnancies had been shorter by several weeks, the labor periods much briefer, and the recovery remarkably rapid. One woman, Sarah Crawford, described giving birth to her son with minimal pain, an experience so different from her previous 3 deliveries that she initially thought something was wrong with the baby. But the child had been perfectly healthy, thriving from the moment of birth. The blood analyses produced results that baffled the examining physicians. When viewed under microscopes, the Crawford family's blood showed cellular structures that appeared subtly different from normal human blood. The red blood cells were slightly smaller and more numerous, potentially explaining the family's apparent resistance to fatigue and altitude effects. The white blood cells showed unusual activity patterns, responding more aggressively to introduced pathogens in laboratory tests. Dr. Chen conducted experiments exposing Crawford blood samples to various disease agents, including material from smallpox scabs, cholera cultures, and tuberculosis tissue. In every case, the Crawford blood showed defensive responses faster and more effective than control samples from the examining physicians themselves. Colonel Blackwood realized that these findings had implications far beyond medical curiosity. If the Crawford family's characteristics could be understood and potentially replicated, the military applications would be enormous. Soldiers with enhanced disease resistance, accelerated healing, and improved physical capabilities would transform warfare. He sent reports to the Secretary of War, emphasizing the strategic value of continuing the research. Within days, he received authorization to expand the study and instructions to maintain absolute secrecy. The Crawford family would remain in the facility indefinitely, and no information about them would be released to the medical community or the public. Samuel Crawford understood what was happening. He was, after all, a trained physician himself, and he recognized the significance of what the examinations were revealing. He had hoped that his family's unusual characteristics would be seen as interesting, but not valuable enough to justify indefinite detention. He had been wrong. The military had no intention of releasing them. They would spend the rest of their lives as research subjects. Their children and grandchildren studied like laboratory specimens. The document he had written and entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh was now the only record of the truth, and Marsh had been reassigned to a frontier post in Montana, safely distant from Washington and unable to intervene. The Crawford family began showing signs of psychological deterioration. The isolation from each other, combined with the constant examinations and the growing realization that they were prisoners, created anxiety and depression that affected even the youngest members. 3-year-old Ruth Crawford stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures and tears. Her mother, Elizabeth, pleaded with the physicians to allow them to be together as a family, even if only for meals. The requests were denied. Blackwood argued that maintaining experimental protocols was essential for scientific validity. What he did not say was that he feared the family would coordinate escape attempts if allowed to gather. But the Crawford family had not survived 3 years in an isolated valley by being passive. They began to resist in small ways that the physicians initially did not recognize as coordinated behavior. During examinations, they provided inconsistent information, making their medical histories appear contradictory. They exaggerated symptoms or denied them randomly, creating confusion in the medical records. The children pretended to have developmental problems, suddenly appearing unable to perform tasks they had completed easily days before. The physicians responded by extending the examinations, bringing in specialists to resolve the contradictions, which was exactly what the family wanted: more time to plan. Samuel Crawford managed to communicate with his oldest son, Thomas, through a method so simple that the guards never detected it. The facility's ventilation system connected the rooms through air ducts, and sounds carried through these ducts if one spoke directly into the vent openings. Late at night, when the guards made less frequent rounds, Samuel and Thomas would take turns speaking and listening at the vents in their rooms. They developed a plan over 3 weeks of these whispered conversations. The plan required patience, perfect timing, and help from an unexpected source: Dr. Margaret Harrison, who was becoming increasingly disturbed by the ethical implications of the research she was conducting. Harrison had entered military medicine believing she could contribute to scientific advancement while treating the wounded with compassion. What she was witnessing at the facility violated every principle she held. The Crawford family were not patients receiving care. They were prisoners being exploited for research without their genuine consent. The children particularly troubled her. They had committed no crime, yet they were being raised in captivity, denied education, social interaction, and normal childhood development. Harrison began keeping her own private records, documenting the conditions and the family's suffering, intending to bring the matter to public attention once she left military service. But Samuel Crawford asked her for something more immediate and far more dangerous: help escaping the facility. Dr. Margaret Harrison faced an impossible choice: helping the Crawford family escape would end her medical career, possibly result in criminal prosecution, and certainly destroy any chance she had of influencing military medicine from within the system. But allowing the situation to continue meant being complicit in what she increasingly viewed as a form of scientific slavery. She struggled with this dilemma for days, lying awake at night in her quarters, unable to reconcile her conscience with her career. The deciding moment came when she witnessed Colonel Blackwood conducting an experiment on young Jacob Crawford without anesthesia, arguing that the child's pain responses needed to be documented to understand his neurological development. The boy's screams echoed through the facility, and Harrison knew she could no longer remain passive. She approached Samuel Crawford during one of her examination sessions, speaking quietly while pretending to check his pulse. She told him she would help, but the escape would need to occur within the next 2 weeks. Blackwood was planning to transfer the family to a more secure facility in upstate New York, where the isolation would be complete and escape impossible. Harrison had access to the facility's duty schedules and knew that guard coverage was thinnest during the early morning hours when only 2 soldiers were awake, one at the front entrance and one in the administrative office. She could create a diversion that would draw both guards away from the family quarters for approximately 10 minutes. That would be their window. Samuel passed this information through the ventilation system to Thomas, who shared it with other family members during brief moments when guards escorted them to the washrooms. The family prepared with the discipline of people who had survived under harsh conditions. They cached small amounts of food from their meals, hiding pieces of bread and dried meat in their clothing. They tore strips from bed sheets to create makeshift rope. They observed the guards' routines, noting which ones were attentive and which were careless. Thomas, who had been a skilled woodsman in Kentucky, used a nail he had worked loose from a floorboard to create a crude lockpick, practicing on his room's door lock during the night until he could open it silently in under a minute. Harrison chose May 30th for the escape attempt. That morning, she would report to the administrative office that she had found evidence of cholera in the facility's water supply, requiring immediate testing of all water sources. This would send both guards running to secure the wells and cisterns, fearing an outbreak that could devastate the facility. During their absence, Harrison would unlock the family quarters, and the Crawfords would have to make their way out through the service entrance at the rear of the building. She could provide no help beyond that. If she left with them, her involvement would be immediately obvious, and soldiers would be dispatched to pursue them within minutes. By remaining behind and acting as though she knew nothing about the escape, she might delay the alarm long enough for the family to gain some distance. The night before the planned escape, Samuel Crawford experienced doubts that nearly stopped everything. He questioned whether he had the right to risk his family's lives on such a dangerous plan. If they were caught attempting escape, Blackwood might separate them permanently, sending family members to different facilities where they would never see each other again. The children might be taken from their parents and raised in government institutions. Was freedom worth such risks? Samuel spent hours in his room, pacing the small space, weighing the alternatives. Finally, he concluded that living as prisoners with no hope of release was not really living at all. His family had not endured the hardships of the Hidden Valley, only to spend the rest of their lives in captivity. They would take the chance, accept the risks, and trust in the skills that had kept them alive during their isolation. May 30th, 1866, dawned gray and humid, with heavy clouds suggesting afternoon thunderstorms. The facility followed its normal routine. Guards conducted morning rounds, checking each prisoner and verifying that the locks were secure. Breakfast was delivered to the rooms on trays. Physicians arrived for the day's examinations. Everything appeared ordinary until shortly after dawn, when Dr. Harrison burst into the administrative office with news of possible cholera contamination. The reaction was immediate and exactly as she had predicted. Both guards abandoned their posts and rushed to investigate the water sources, accompanied by 2 junior physicians who feared an outbreak. Harrison then moved quickly through the facility, unlocking doors to the family quarters and whispering urgent instructions to each Crawford family member she released. The family moved with remarkable coordination and silence. Samuel led, carrying 2-year-old Jacob. Thomas brought up the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. They encountered one elderly orderly in the hallway, but Samuel, using his physician's authority, told the man that they were being relocated to different rooms for medical reasons. The orderly, confused but unwilling to question a doctor, stepped aside and let them pass. They reached the service entrance without further incident and found it unlocked as Harrison had promised. Beyond the door lay a wooded area that extended for several hundred yards before reaching a road. If they could make it into those trees, they would have cover for their initial flight. The escape almost failed in the first 30 seconds. As the family emerged from the building, a delivery wagon pulled up to the service entrance, arriving earlier than scheduled to drop off medical supplies. The driver saw the Crawford family and immediately recognized that something was wrong. These people were clearly not staff, and their movements suggested flight rather than authorized departure. He opened his mouth to shout for the guards, but Thomas Crawford moved with the speed of someone who had hunted in dangerous mountains. He reached the driver before the man could make a sound, pulling him from the wagon and clamping a hand over his mouth. Samuel spoke quickly and quietly, explaining that they were political prisoners being held illegally, that they meant no harm, and that the driver would not be injured if he remained silent. The driver, frightened but also intrigued by the situation, nodded agreement. Thomas made a rapid decision that changed their escape plan. He commandeered the delivery wagon, ordering the driver to lie down in the back and cover himself with canvas. The Crawford family climbed aboard, and Thomas took the reins, driving the wagon away from the facility at a normal pace that would not attract attention. To anyone watching from the building's windows, it appeared to be the delivery wagon leaving after completing its drop-off. By the time the guards returned from investigating the false cholera alarm and discovered the empty rooms, the Crawford family was already 2 miles away, heading toward the city center, where they could disappear into the morning crowds. The alarm was raised within 20 minutes of the escape. Colonel Blackwood, upon learning that his prisoners had vanished, flew into a rage that terrified everyone in the facility. He immediately suspected Dr. Harrison, but she maintained her innocence with such convincing confusion that he could not prove her involvement. Blackwood dispatched soldiers to search the surrounding area, sent telegrams to military posts throughout the region, and ordered the city police to watch all railroad stations and river docks. He offered a substantial reward for information leading to the Crawford family's capture. But Washington in 1866 was a chaotic city, still recovering from the war, filled with refugees, former soldiers, and displaced families. 27 people, even ones with unusual characteristics, could vanish into such a population if they were careful. The Crawford family, guided by Samuel's quick thinking, did not attempt to flee the city immediately. Instead, they sought refuge in the one place military authorities would be unlikely to search, the poorest neighborhoods where freed slaves had established communities during and after the war. Samuel had treated black patients in Kentucky and knew that many freed people had little love for federal authorities who promised freedom but delivered continued hardship. He found a church in a neighborhood called Foggy Bottom, explained their situation to the minister, and asked for sanctuary. The minister, Reverend Isaiah Grant, listened to the story with a skepticism that gradually turned to sympathy. He agreed to hide the family in the church basement while making inquiries about safe passage out of the city. For 3 days, the Crawford family lived in that basement, listening to the sounds of soldiers searching the streets above. They rationed the small amount of food they had taken from the facility and the provisions Reverend Grant brought them. The children, frightened but understanding the seriousness of their situation, remained quiet even when they heard military boots passing directly overhead. Samuel knew that they could not stay in Washington much longer. Blackwood would eventually expand the search to include these neighborhoods. They needed to leave the city, leave the region entirely, and find a place where they could disappear permanently. The question was where such a place might exist in a nation that was becoming increasingly connected by railroads, telegraph, and government bureaucracy. Reverend Isaiah Grant had connections that Samuel Crawford never would have imagined. The underground network that had helped escaped slaves reach freedom during the war had not disbanded with emancipation. It had evolved into a system for helping freed people navigate a society that claimed to offer them citizenship while denying them justice. Grant contacted individuals in this network, explaining that he was protecting a family fleeing government persecution. Within 2 days, he had arranged passage for the Crawfords on a freight train heading west toward Ohio. The family would travel hidden in a boxcar carrying farm equipment, and they would need to remain absolutely silent during the journey to avoid detection by railroad security. On the night of June 2, 1866, the Crawford family left the church basement and made their way through dark streets to the railroad yards. Grant personally escorted them, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every alley and shortcut in the neighborhood. They encountered 2 police patrols, but Grant had timed their route to coincide with shift changes when officers were less attentive. At the rail yard, a freight supervisor who owed Grant favors from wartime days unlocked a boxcar and gestured for the family to climb inside. The space was cramped, packed with plows and harrows that left little room for human passengers, but the Crawfords arranged themselves as comfortably as possible. The supervisor closed and locked the door from outside, and they were left in darkness, listening to the sounds of the yard as the train was assembled. The journey west took 5 days, though it felt like weeks to the family trapped in the boxcar. The train stopped frequently at small stations where additional freight cars were attached or detached. Each stop brought the risk of discovery. Railroad workers occasionally opened boxcars for inspection, and the Crawfords had to remain absolutely motionless during these moments, barely breathing, hoping that the dim light and cramped conditions would prevent anyone from noticing them behind the farm equipment. Young Jacob, who had been coached by his mother about the importance of silence, performed admirably for a 2-year-old, communicating only through hand gestures and wide, frightened eyes. The train passed through Maryland, Pennsylvania, and into Ohio, carrying them away from the government's immediate reach, but not from its potential grasp. Samuel knew that Colonel Blackwood would have sent descriptions of the family to military posts throughout the country, and telegraph lines would carry news of the escape faster than any train. They needed to reach a destination where federal authority was weak, where records were poorly kept, and where a family could start over without extensive documentation. Samuel thought about the Western Territories, places like Montana or Wyoming, where settlement was sparse and government presence minimal, but traveling that far with 27 people, including young children, seemed impossible without resources. When the train finally stopped in Columbus, Ohio, the freight supervisor who had helped them in Washington had arranged for a contact to meet them. A man named Jacob Muller, a German immigrant who operated a small farm outside the city, opened the boxcar door in the pre-dawn darkness and quickly ushered the Crawford family into his wagon. He spoke limited English, but he understood their need for secrecy. Muller took them to his farm where his large extended family provided food, clothing, and temporary shelter in a barn that had been converted to house seasonal workers. Muller asked no questions about why they were fleeing or what made them different. He had fled political persecution in Europe and recognized that same desperation in Samuel Crawford's eyes. The Crawford family stayed with the Muller family for 2 weeks, recovering from their ordeal and planning their next move. Samuel had very little money left from what the military had paid him before the escape, certainly not enough to establish the family somewhere safely. He needed work. But practicing medicine would require registration with local authorities and might alert the military to his location. Thomas suggested that they return to what they knew best, living off the land in a remote location where government reach was limited. Samuel resisted this idea initially, having hoped that his family could live normal lives in a proper community. But as the days passed, and he heard reports of military inquiries in nearby towns about a missing family, he realized that isolation might be their only option for survival. Muller told them about a region in southern Ohio, near the Kentucky border, where old-growth forests still existed in areas too rugged for farming. Small communities of people who wanted to avoid scrutiny had established themselves in those woods. Deserters from both armies during the war, freed slaves who didn't trust Reconstruction governments, and immigrants who had entered the country without proper documentation. The region had a reputation for being inhospitable to outsiders and authorities. If the Crawford family could reach that area and integrate themselves into one of those hidden communities, they might finally find safety. Muller offered to transport them as far as his wagon could travel, and he gave them supplies and tools that would help them survive in the wilderness. The journey south took them through landscapes still marked by the war. They saw burned farmhouses that no one had rebuilt, untended fields reverting to weeds, and makeshift graves marked with crude wooden crosses. The nation was attempting to heal, but the wounds were deep and visible everywhere. Samuel felt a profound sadness looking at this destruction. His family had fled the war, survived in isolation, discovered something remarkable about human adaptation, and now were fugitives from the government that should have protected them. The bitter irony was not lost on him. Science, which he had devoted his life to serving, had become the instrument of his family's persecution. They reached the forest region Muller had described in mid-June, and Muller wished them well before turning his wagon back toward Columbus. The Crawford family stood at the edge of a vast woodland, carrying only what they could fit in packs on their backs. Thomas scouted ahead, finding a narrow trail that showed signs of occasional use. They followed this trail deeper into the forest, moving cautiously, alert for any indication of the hidden communities Muller had mentioned. On the second day, they encountered a man checking rabbit snares. He was young, maybe 20, with the wary eyes of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Thomas approached him carefully, hands visible and empty, explaining that they were seeking a place to settle away from authorities. The young man, who gave his name only as Charlie, studied them for a long moment. He seemed particularly interested in the children, perhaps assessing whether the family posed any threat. Finally, he told them to follow him. He led them through terrain that seemed impassable, along paths that were invisible until you were directly on them, to a settlement of perhaps 30 people living in cabins so well camouflaged that Samuel had walked within 20 feet of several before noticing them. The community leader, a former Union officer named Captain James Wheeler, interviewed Samuel about their reasons for seeking refuge. Samuel decided to tell the truth, or at least a version of it. He explained that his family had been held against their will by military authorities who wanted to study them for medical research, and that they had escaped and were now being sought as fugitives. Wheeler's response surprised Samuel. The captain said that half the people in this settlement were fugitives of one kind or another, fleeing warrants, debts, or pasts they wanted to forget. The community's single rule was that no one asked questions about anyone's history, and everyone contributed to the collective survival through work. If the Crawford family could accept those terms, they were welcome to stay. Samuel agreed immediately. His family had survived 3 years in isolation in Kentucky. They could certainly survive in this community, contributing their skills while maintaining the secrecy that protected them. Wheeler assigned them a section of the settlement where they could build their cabins, and the other residents, following the community's code of non-interference, helped with construction while asking nothing about the unusual appearance of some of the Crawford children or the family's evident desperation. For the first time since leaving their hidden valley 4 months earlier, the Crawford family began to feel something approaching security. They were still hiding, still fearful of discovery, but they were together and living on their own terms. Samuel established himself as the settlement's physician, treating injuries and illnesses with the herbal knowledge he had accumulated. The children began to relax, playing in the forest with other youngsters from the community. Margaret Crawford, Samuel's wife, started a small garden near their cabin. Thomas and his brothers hunted and fished, providing food for the family. Life was hard, but it was their life, not one dictated by military authorities who saw them as research subjects rather than human beings. But Samuel knew that their safety was fragile and temporary. Colonel Blackwood would not stop searching for them. The military had invested too much in studying the family to simply write them off as lost. Sooner or later, someone would report seeing unusual children in this remote forest community, or a military patrol would stumble across the settlement, or one of the residents would betray them for the reward money. Samuel needed a more permanent solution, a way to ensure that his family could live without constant fear, and he needed to make certain that the truth about what had happened to them, about the government's actions and the remarkable characteristics they had developed, would not die with them if the worst occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Marsh had not forgotten about the Crawford family or the sealed documents Samuel had entrusted to him. His reassignment to Fort Benton in Montana Territory had been sudden and convenient for the military authorities who wanted him far from Washington and unable to interfere with their plans for the family. Marsh understood that he had been sidelined, but he was not powerless. Before leaving Washington, he had placed Samuel's document in the hands of his brother, Richard Marsh, a lawyer in Philadelphia, who maintained a private vault for sensitive materials. Richard had been instructed to hold the document for 50 years, as Samuel had requested, but he was also authorized to open it earlier if evidence emerged that the Crawford family had died, or if their safety required the truth to be revealed. Marsh's duties in Montana were mundane, supervising the construction of military infrastructure and maintaining relations with local Indian tribes. But he maintained correspondence with contacts in Washington, discreetly inquiring about the Crawford family's situation. In late June 1866, he received a letter from Dr. Margaret Harrison, who had found a way to contact him through a mutual acquaintance. Her letter was carefully worded to avoid explicit confession, but the meaning was clear. The family had escaped, Harrison wrote, and military authorities were conducting an intensive search. Colonel Blackwood had become obsessed with finding them, devoting resources that seemed disproportionate to the supposed importance of a single research study. Harrison suggested that Blackwood was facing professional consequences for losing the prisoners and was desperate to recapture them to save his career. Marsh made a decision that risked his own military future. He wrote to his brother in Philadelphia, instructing him to make copies of Samuel Crawford's document and to deposit those copies with 3 trusted colleagues, a physician, a journalist, and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. If Marsh did not send a letter every 6 months confirming that he remained alive and free, Richard was to assume that military authorities had silenced him and the colleagues were to publish the Crawford document immediately. This arrangement created a form of insurance for both Marsh and the Crawford family. As long as the document's existence remained a threat, the military would be constrained in what actions they could take against either party. Marsh then wrote directly to Colonel Blackwood, a letter whose tone was respectful, but whose content was unmistakably threatening. He informed Blackwood that he possessed documentary evidence about the Crawford family's treatment, that this evidence had been secured in multiple locations beyond military reach, and that it would be published if any harm came to the family or if the search for them continued. Marsh suggested that the most prudent course would be to declare the family deceased, close the case, and move on to other research. The alternative, Marsh wrote, would be a public scandal that would damage the Army Medical Department's reputation and likely result in congressional investigations that would embarrass everyone involved. Blackwood's response took 3 weeks to reach Montana, and when it arrived, the tone was cold with barely restrained fury. The colonel accused Marsh of insubordination, theft of military property, and conspiracy to harbor fugitives. He threatened court-martial proceedings and prosecution for treason. But buried in the angry rhetoric was the implicit admission of defeat. Blackwood wrote that the Crawford family was no longer a priority for the medical department, that resources could not be indefinitely devoted to searching for subjects who had probably perished during their flight, and that the case would be closed pending any new information about their whereabouts. The letter concluded with a warning that Marsh should never again involve himself in matters beyond his assigned duties. Marsh understood that this was as close to victory as he was likely to achieve. The military would stop actively searching for the Crawford family, though they would certainly seize them if the family was discovered by chance. It was not perfect safety, but it was significantly better than being actively hunted. Marsh immediately sent letters to Richard in Philadelphia and to Dr. Harrison in Washington, informing them of this development. He suggested that Harrison find a way to communicate with the Crawford family if possible, to let them know that the immediate danger had diminished, but that permanent vigilance remained necessary. Harrison received Marsh's letter in early September 1866 and faced the challenge of locating the Crawford family without drawing military attention to them. She solved this problem through the same network that had helped them escape, Reverend Isaiah Grant, and the community organizations that assisted people trying to disappear from official notice. Grant's contacts eventually located the hidden settlement in southern Ohio and got word to Samuel Crawford that the military search had been called off. Samuel received this news with cautious relief. He understood that his family would never be completely safe, that they would need to remain hidden and vigilant, But the immediate threat of forced return to military custody had passed. The Crawford family continued living in the forest settlement for 2 more years, building permanent structures and integrating fully into the community. Samuel educated his children and grandchildren as best he could with limited resources, teaching them medicine, mathematics, and natural science. He also taught them about what made them different, explaining the physical changes that had occurred during their isolation in the Kentucky Valley. He wanted them to understand their own biology so they could make informed decisions about their futures. The unusual characteristics that had made them valuable to military researchers would also make them distinctive in any normal community. They would need to be careful about where they lived and how much they revealed about themselves. In 1868, Samuel made a decision that surprised his family. He announced that they should leave the Ohio settlement and travel west to the newly opened territories where land was available and government oversight remained minimal. Thomas argued that they were safe where they were, that moving would expose them to new risks. But Samuel countered that the settlement's very existence depended on official ignorance, and that ignorance could not be guaranteed forever. Better to relocate while they had the option than to wait until circumstances forced them to flee again. The family debated for weeks, but ultimately Samuel's judgment prevailed. They had followed him into the Kentucky Valley, trusted him during the escape from Washington, and survived because of his decisions. They would follow him west. The Crawford family left Ohio in the spring of 1868, joining a wagon train heading for the Oregon Territory. They presented themselves as farmers from Kentucky, seeking new land, which was true enough in its way. The wagon master accepted them without extensive questions. Thousands of families were moving west, and few people cared about detailed backgrounds. The journey took 5 months, crossing prairies and mountains, enduring weather extremes and the constant physical hardship of overland travel. The Crawford children, particularly those born in the Kentucky Valley, handled the difficulties better than most families in the wagon train. Their unusual physical characteristics, which Samuel had worried might draw unwanted attention, actually proved beneficial. They tired less easily, recovered from minor injuries faster, and seemed immune to the dysentery that plagued other travelers. They settled in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, claiming land under the Homestead Act, and building a farm that would sustain them for generations. Samuel chose a location remote from major settlements, but not so isolated as to seem suspicious. Over the following decades, the Crawford family lived quietly, avoiding attention while contributing to their local community. The unusual characteristics that had made them targets for military research gradually became less pronounced in later generations, diluted through marriages with local families. By the early 20th century, the Crawford descendants were indistinguishable from their neighbors, though family stories about their unique history were carefully preserved and passed down through private oral tradition. Samuel Crawford died in 1889 at the age of 73, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. He had lived to see his family safe and established, which was more than he had dared hope during the desperate days of 1866. His final words to his descendants were a warning and a blessing. He told them to remember where they came from, to understand that their survival had required sacrifice and courage, but also to embrace normal lives without fear. The document he had written 23 years earlier remained sealed in a Philadelphia vault, an insurance policy that had never needed to be used. It would remain there, forgotten by everyone except a few members of the Marsh family, until historians discovered it decades later while researching Civil War medical records. The Crawford family's story became a footnote in medical history, discussed in academic journals but never widely known to the public. The remarkable biological changes that had occurred during their isolation in Kentucky remained unexplained by 19th-century science and were dismissed by many researchers as exaggeration or myth. Only in the late 20th century, when advances in genetics and evolutionary biology provided tools to understand rapid adaptive changes in isolated populations, did scientists begin to recognize that the Crawford case might have been genuine. By then, the direct descendants had dispersed throughout the American West, their unusual characteristics fully integrated into the broader population, leaving only fragmentary records and fading stories to hint at what had occurred in a hidden valley during the chaos of the Civil War. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.